Somewhere along the way, an entire industry of relationship advice convinced people that love could be earned through effort, that enough thoughtful gestures, enough favors, enough visible proof of care would eventually accumulate into the kind of security a relationship needs to thrive. This works reasonably well for a great many people. It works considerably less well for avoidance, and understanding exactly why requires abandoning one of the most persistent, most exhausting myths in the entire conversation about how to love someone with this particular attachment style. Effort isn't the currency that matters here. It never was. And the sooner this gets understood clearly, the sooner an enormous amount of wasted, unrewarded exhaustion can finally stop. What actually matters to an avoidant, the single thing their entire nervous system is quietly, constantly scanning for in every interaction, has almost nothing to do with what gets done for them. It has everything to do with a specific internal experience they either feel in someone's presence or don't, an experience that no amount of gift-giving, favor-doing, or thoughtful gesture-making can manufacture if it isn't already there. Anyone listening who has spent considerable time and energy trying to earn an avoidant partner's security through consistent effort, favors, thoughtfulness, and care, only to watch that effort seemingly evaporate without producing the closeness or trust it should have earned, deserves to understand exactly why that specific strategy was always going to fall short and what actually would have mattered instead. It's worth naming before going further why this particular myth, the idea that effort and gesture making reliably build security in any relationship, regardless of attachment style, persists so stubbornly despite how poorly it tends to work with avoidant partners specifically. This assumption isn't unreasonable in general. For a great many relationships and a great many attachment styles, visible effort genuinely does build trust and security over time, precisely because it directly addresses the specific anxiety most commonly driving relational insecurity, uncertainty about whether one is valued. Applying this same general principle uniformly across every attachment style, without accounting for how differently avoidant psychology processes exactly this kind of visible investment, is exactly where the mismatch this exploration has been examining actually originates. To understand why acts of service and visible effort fail to produce security in an avoidant relationship the way they might in other relational contexts, it helps to examine what these gestures actually communicate and to whom they communicate it most effectively. Acts of service, gifts, favors, thoughtful gestures function primarily as external, observable proof of investment, evidence visible enough to be pointed to, remembered, and appreciated consciously. This kind of evidence works remarkably well for people whose primary relational anxiety centers around uncertainty regarding whether they're valued, since visible, repeated proof of effort directly addresses that specific uncertainty. An avoidant's primary relational anxiety operates according to an entirely different logic, and this is where the mismatch begins. Avoidants aren't typically anxious about whether they're valued in some abstract general sense. Their anxiety centers considerably more specifically around exposure, the fear of being fully seen, fully known, and found somehow lacking or overwhelming once that full exposure occurs. Effort and gestures, however generous and however genuinely well-intentioned, don't actually address this specific fear at all. If anything, excessive effort can sometimes intensify it, since generous, visible investment from someone else can inadvertently increase the pressure an avoidant feels to reciprocate in kind, pressure that activates exactly the defensive retreat their fear of exposure is organized around producing. This explains a pattern that confuses and frustrates a great many people trying to love an avoidant partner well. The sense that increased effort sometimes seems to produce increased distance rather than increased closeness, as though the relationship were operating according to some inverse logic that makes no intuitive sense. This isn't actually inverse logic. It's simply evidence that effort was never the variable this particular psychology responds to, and increasing a variable that was never the relevant one in the first place doesn't produce the expected result, regardless of how much more of it gets applied. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone trying to warm a room by adjusting the color of the light bulbs, choosing warmer, more inviting shades, believing that the right aesthetic choice will eventually produce actual warmth. No matter how many bulbs get changed, no matter how carefully the color gets calibrated, the room's actual temperature never changes because light color was never actually the variable controlling temperature in the first place. This is close to what happens when someone pours consistent effort and thoughtful gesture making into an avoidant relationship, hoping that enough of the right gestures will eventually produce the security and closeness being sought. The room never actually warms. Not because the gestures weren't generous or weren't genuinely appreciated on some surface level, but because gestures were never the variable actually controlling whether an avoidant feels safe enough to remain close. It's worth naming directly then what actually functions as this controlling variable, the single thing an avoidance psychology is genuinely, consistently responding to across every interaction, regardless of how much or how little effort and gesture making happens to be present alongside it. That variable is the felt absence of performance pressure, the specific internal experience of being able to exist in someone's presence exactly as one currently is, without needing to manage, adjust, perform, or apologize for whatever mood, distance, or imperfection happens to be present in that particular moment. This single variable deserves careful, precise unpacking because it's easy to misunderstand what it actually means in practice. It doesn't mean an avoidant simply wants total permissiveness, an absence of any boundaries or expectations whatsoever. Boundaries and reasonable expectations remain entirely compatible with this variable. And in fact, as explored in other examinations of this topic, boundaries paired with genuine acceptance tend to be one of the more powerful combinations available for producing genuine security in an avoidant partner. What this variable actually refers to is something more specific, whether an avoidant experiences someone's presence as requiring constant self-monitoring and adjustment in order to remain acceptable, or whether that presence allows for a kind of genuine, unmonitored existence, imperfect, inconsistent, sometimes withdrawn, without that imperfection immediately triggering visible disappointment, subtle punishment, or an escalating campaign of effort clearly designed to correct it. This is where the mismatch with effort-based strategies becomes considerably clearer. Excessive, visible effort, however well-intentioned, often carries an implicit message that can land quite differently than intended. The suggestion that the relationship requires ongoing maintenance and correction. That something about the current state of things isn't quite sufficient and needs to be actively improved through additional investment. Even when this message isn't remotely what's actually being communicated or intended, an avoidant's heightened sensitivity to exactly this kind of implicit pressure means they often receive it anyway, regardless of how genuinely it wasn't meant that way. This explains something that many people find genuinely counterintuitive once they first encounter it, why an avoidant partner sometimes seems considerably more relaxed and more genuinely present around people who seem to invest less obvious effort into managing or maintaining the relationship, co-workers, casual friends, family members who don't actively work to demonstrate care through constant gesture and favor. This isn't because these relationships matter more. It's because these relationships typically don't carry the same implicit pressure towards self-monitoring and performance that a partner's visible, escalating effort inadvertently introduces, allowing the avoidance guard to remain considerably lower simply because there's less felt pressure requiring it to stay raised. It's worth naming what this specific variable, the felt absence of performance pressure, actually looks like in practice, because it deserves concrete description rather than remaining an abstract concept difficult to translate into actual behavior. It helps to describe several additional specific markers of this quality, because concrete examples make it considerably easier to recognize and cultivate than an abstract definition alone ever could. One marker involves how ordinary daily moments get handled, whether comfortable silence is genuinely tolerated without an anxious need to fill it with conversation or reassurance seeking, or whether every quiet moment carries an implicit pressure to check in, to confirm that everything is fine, to ensure the relationship's emotional temperature remains actively monitored and managed. Genuine tolerance of ordinary silence, without treating it as evidence of a problem requiring address, tends to be one of the more reliable, everyday indicators of this quality being present. Another marker involves how an avoidant partner's low energy or withdrawn moments get received, whether they're met with genuine acceptance, allowing space without immediately interpreting withdrawal as a personal rejection, requiring correction or explanation, or whether they trigger an anxious scramble to identify what's wrong and fix it as quickly as possible. This second response, however well-intentioned, tends to communicate exactly the kind of implicit performance pressure this exploration has identified as counterproductive, treating an avoidant's ordinary human fluctuation in energy or mood as a problem requiring immediate management rather than simply an unremarkable part of their day-to-day existence. A further marker involves how differences of opinion or minor disagreements get handled, whether they can exist and be discussed without an accompanying urgency toward immediate resolution, or whether unresolved tension feels intolerable enough that it must be addressed and settled before either person can relax again. Genuine tolerance for some degree of ongoing, unresolved tension, trusting that it doesn't need to be immediately fixed in order for the relationship to remain fundamentally secure, tends to communicate considerably more safety to an avoidant partner than an anxious insistence on resolving every disagreement completely and immediately. A final marker worth naming involves the general emotional posture someone brings into everyday interactions, whether that posture carries an underlying watchfulness, subtly scanning for signs of the avoidant's engagement or disengagement, or whether it carries a more settled, present quality that isn't constantly, if subtly, checking for reassurance about where things currently stand. This watchfulness, even when it never gets expressed verbally, tends to be sensed quite clearly by an avoidant partner, precisely because it introduces exactly the kind of implicit monitoring and pressure this entire exploration has identified as counterproductive to genuine security. It shows up as a general tone of acceptance during ordinary, unremarkable interactions, one that doesn't shift noticeably depending on whether the avoidant happens to be particularly engaged, articulate, or emotionally available in that specific moment. It shows up as an absence of visible disappointment or subtle withdrawal in response to an avoidant's own withdrawal or inconsistency, not because that withdrawal doesn't register or doesn't have any impact, but because whatever response it does produce doesn't get communicated in a way that feels like punishment or pressure toward immediate correction. It shows up too in how questions get asked and how conversations get initiated, whether they carry an implicit demand for a specific kind of response, or whether they leave genuine room for the avoidant to respond honestly, including responding with uncertainty, minimal engagement, or a need for more space, without that honest response being treated as a problem requiring immediate address. And it shows up in the general emotional atmosphere surrounding disagreement or conflict, whether these moments carry an escalating intensity that requires careful management and performance in order to de-escalate, or whether they can exist and eventually resolve without demanding that kind of constant, effortful maintenance throughout. There's something worth validating clearly here for anyone listening who has felt, throughout a relationship with an avoidant partner, a persistent, exhausting sense that they were somehow always managing something, monitoring the emotional temperature, adjusting their own behavior to keep things stable, without ever being told directly that this management was expected or required. There's an important caution worth naming here as well, because this entire concept, allowing an avoidant partner to exist without performance pressure, could easily be misapplied in a way that produces genuine harm if taken too far or applied without discernment. This quality was never meant to suggest that genuinely hurtful or disrespectful behavior should simply be tolerated without comment in service of avoiding any appearance of pressure or correction. There's a meaningful difference between allowing someone room to be inconsistent, imperfect, or emotionally withdrawn at times, and accepting behavior that crosses into genuine disrespect, dishonesty, or harm. The variable being described throughout this exploration applies specifically to ordinary human imperfection and emotional variability, not to a blank check for treatment that violates basic standards of respect and care. This distinction matters enormously because without it, this entire framework risks being misused to justify exactly the kind of one-sided accommodation already cautioned against elsewhere in this exploration. quietly absorbing genuinely poor treatment under the mistaken belief that naming it or objecting to it constitutes exactly the kind of performance pressure an avoidant partner needs to be protected from. Naming genuine harm, holding a real boundary against behavior that crosses into disrespect, is not the same as the ordinary, moment-to-moment performance pressure this exploration has been describing throughout. And conflating the two produces a distorted, ultimately unhealthy version of acceptance that serves no one well, including the avoidant partner supposedly being protected by it. It's worth addressing directly why this single variable matters so much more than effort specifically for avoidance, in a way that helps clarify the underlying psychological mechanism rather than simply asserting it as fact. There's a deeper physiological grounding worth explaining here as well, because it helps clarify why this specific variable operates so consistently and so powerfully, rather than this pattern being simply a matter of individual preference or personality. Nervous systems generally regulate their sense of safety through ongoing, largely automatic assessment of whether their current environment requires vigilance or permits genuine relaxation. This assessment happens continuously, below the level of conscious thought, and it responds specifically to cues, suggesting whether the immediate social environment demands ongoing self-monitoring and adjustment, or whether it permits a more settled, unguarded state. For someone whose nervous system has been shaped, often through considerable earlier experience, to associate closeness with exactly this kind of ongoing self-monitoring, requiring careful management of one's own behavior in order to remain acceptable or avoid rejection, any environment that continues requiring this monitoring, however subtly, keeps that nervous system in a persistent, low-grade state of vigilance rather than genuine relaxation. This vigilance operates independent of how much genuine affection or effort exists alongside it, because vigilance responds to perceived demand for self-monitoring specifically, not to the overall presence or absence of care. This explains why an avoidance nervous system can register genuine, significant affection from a partner while simultaneously remaining in this vigilant, guarded state, if that affection happens to arrive packaged alongside implicit signals requiring ongoing performance or adjustment. The two things, affection and vigilance, aren't mutually exclusive, and understanding this helps explain why so many relationships involving genuine care on both sides still fail to produce the settled security either person is hoping for. The nervous system responds to the specific quality of ongoing interaction, not simply to the overall amount of care being expressed within it. Avoidants, as explored extensively elsewhere, tend to carry a deep, often unconscious conviction that being fully seen and fully known inevitably leads to rejection or engulfment, a conviction typically formed considerably earlier in life than any specific adult relationship. This conviction means that any signal suggesting a relationship requires performance or correction in order to remain viable tends to activate this old fear directly, regardless of how small or how well-intentioned that signal actually was. Effort-based strategies, however generous and however genuinely motivated by love, almost inevitably contain at least some implicit signal of this kind, since effort typically responds to some perceived need or deficiency, addressing something the relationship currently lacks. Even when this isn't the conscious intention behind a particular gesture, an avoidant's heightened sensitivity to exactly this kind of implicit signal means the message often lands regardless, activating precisely the defensive response the gesture was never meant to trigger. The single variable being described throughout this exploration, the felt absence of performance pressure, works entirely differently, precisely because it doesn't rely on any external gesture or effort at all. It's communicated instead through the ongoing ambient quality of how someone responds to an avoidant's actual unfiltered presence, moment to moment, rather than through any deliberate, effortful demonstration of care. This means it can't actually be manufactured through increased effort, however well-intentioned that effort happens to be, since increased effort itself often works directly against the specific quality this variable actually requires. This creates a genuinely difficult paradox for anyone trying to love an avoidant partner well, particularly anyone whose natural instinct, when a relationship feels uncertain or insecure, is to respond with increased effort and increased demonstration of care. This instinct, however well-intentioned and however effective it might be in other relational contexts, tends to work directly against what an avoidant partner actually needs in order to feel genuinely secure. Recognizing this paradox clearly is often one of the more important, if counterintuitive, pieces of understanding available to anyone navigating a relationship with this specific attachment style. It's worth addressing something important here, because everything explored throughout this piece could easily be misread as suggesting that effort, gestures, and demonstrated care have no value at all in a relationship with an avoidant partner, or that these things should be actively withheld in service of producing this single, more important variable instead. This would be a significant misapplication of everything being explored here. Effort and thoughtful gestures remain a genuine, valuable part of any healthy relationship, avoidant or otherwise. And nothing in this exploration suggests these things should be eliminated or deliberately withheld as some kind of strategy. What this exploration actually suggests is considerably more specific: that effort alone, without the underlying quality of accepting, unmonitored presence already described, will not produce the security an avoidant partner actually needs, regardless of how much or how generously that effort gets offered. The healthiest approach involves both genuine care and thoughtfulness expressed naturally, alongside the deeper, more foundational quality of allowing an avoidant partner to exist, without constant self-monitoring or performance pressure. Neither one substitutes for the other, but attempting to compensate for the absence of the second through an excess of the first tends to produce exactly the frustrating, seemingly inverse dynamic already described. More effort somehow producing more distance rather than more closeness. There's something worth exploring further because it addresses a specific, common question that naturally follows from everything discussed so far: how someone actually develops and maintains this specific quality, the felt absence of performance pressure, given that it can't simply be produced through deliberate effort the way more conventional relationship building strategies typically operate. This is worth naming honestly, because the answer involves something considerably less straightforward than a simple technique or strategy that can be applied directly. This quality tends to emerge most naturally from a person's own internal security, a settled sense of their own worth that doesn't depend heavily on an avoidant partner's specific reactions or specific level of engagement in any given moment. Someone whose own sense of security remains relatively stable, regardless of how an avoidant partner happens to be behaving in a particular moment, tends to produce this quality almost automatically, simply because their own emotional state doesn't require the avoidant's careful management or performance in order to remain steady. Someone whose own security depends more heavily on an avoidant partner's specific, consistent engagement tends to produce the opposite dynamic almost automatically as well. An implicit pressure toward performance that emerges not from any conscious intention, but from the genuine, if unconscious, need for that performance in order to manage one's own anxiety about the relationship's stability. This distinction matters enormously because it means the single variable being described throughout this exploration isn't simply a technique to be learned and applied. It's considerably more dependent on one's own internal state, one's own relationship with uncertainty and security, than on any specific behaviour or strategy that could be deliberately performed regardless of that internal state. This is genuinely difficult information to receive because it suggests that producing this quality authentically often requires considerable work on one's own security and self-worth, rather than simply learning the right words or the right approach to use with an avoidant partner specifically. For anyone listening who recognises that their own anxiety and need for reassurance may have been contributing to exactly the performance pressure being described throughout this exploration, there's something important worth offering here, without any accompanying shame or self-blame. This pattern doesn't reflect a personal failing. It typically reflects one's own attachment history, shaped by circumstances and experiences entirely separate from the current relationship, that produced a genuine, understandable need for consistent reassurance and engagement in order to feel secure. Recognizing this pattern clearly is the necessary first step toward addressing it, not evidence that anything about one's own worth or lovability was ever actually the problem. There's something crucial worth naming here as well. something that deserves direct, honest treatment rather than being glossed over in favour of a tidier conclusion. Developing genuine internal security considerable enough to produce this quality naturally, rather than through effortful performance, often takes considerable time and, in many cases, benefits significantly from dedicated support, whether through therapy, through deliberate self-reflection, or through other resources specifically oriented around building genuine, internally sourced security, rather than security dependent on another person's specific behaviour. This isn't a quick fix, and anyone hoping for a simple technique that instantly produces this quality deserves honest acknowledgement that no such quick technique actually exists. It's worth addressing something important here as well, because everything explored throughout this piece could easily be misapplied if taken as suggesting that the entire burden of producing security in an avoidant relationship rests solely on one partner's own internal work, while the avoidant partner bears no corresponding responsibility at all. This would be an inaccurate and ultimately unfair conclusion. Avoidants carry their own significant responsibility for developing the capacity to tolerate genuine intimacy and genuine vulnerability. Work that doesn't happen automatically, simply because a partner has successfully developed the internal security to stop performing anxious pursuit. A relationship where only one person does this kind of internal work tends to remain fundamentally imbalanced, regardless of how much that one person's efforts genuinely improve the relationship's overall atmosphere. This distinction matters because it protects against a specific, unhealthy conclusion that sometimes emerges from this kind of exploration: the belief that loving an avoidant well simply requires endless self-improvement and endless tolerance on one side, while the avoidant themselves bears no corresponding obligation to grow, communicate, and eventually offer the kind of consistency and vulnerability a genuinely healthy, mutual relationship actually requires. Both people's internal work matters, and a relationship where one person continually adjusts and grows while the other remains permanently exempt from doing the same isn't actually a template for health. It's simply a more sophisticated, more sustainable version of the same imbalance already explored throughout this entire piece. It's worth naming what genuine reciprocity actually looks like within this specific framework, because the absence of performance pressure was never meant to describe a one-directional arrangement where only one partner's presence gets treated with this kind of unmonitored acceptance. In a genuinely healthy relationship, this same quality eventually needs to flow in both directions. An avoidant partner also learning, over time and through their own deliberate effort, to extend this same kind of accepting, unpressured presence toward their partner's own imperfections, inconsistencies, and difficult moments. A relationship where only one person receives this quality, while the other continues operating under considerable pressure and monitoring, isn't actually the healthy outcome this exploration has been describing. It's simply a different, more subtle version of the same imbalance, this time flowing in the opposite direction. This means the ultimate, healthiest goal isn't simply learning to extend unconditional, unmonitored acceptance toward an avoidant partner indefinitely, regardless of whether that same quality ever gets returned. It's building toward a relationship where both people gradually learn to offer this quality to each other. A mutual, evolving capacity for genuine acceptance that neither partner has to sustain entirely on their own, indefinitely, without any reciprocal effort or growth from the other person involved. There's something worth turning toward now that centers entirely on the person doing this considerable internal work rather than on the avoidant partner benefiting from it, because everything explored throughout this piece has necessarily focused on decoding what an avoidant actually needs, and that focus, however clarifying, shouldn't overshadow what this entire process actually requires and reveals about the person capable of undertaking it. Developing genuine internal security, significant enough to stop performing anxious pursuit, to allow another person's imperfection and inconsistency to exist without requiring immediate correction or reassurance, represents genuine, significant psychological growth, regardless of whether a particular avoidant partner ever fully recognizes or reciprocates it. This growth remains valuable and remains real independent of its effect on any specific relationship, because it reflects a genuinely healthier, more secure relationship with one's own worth, one that will continue serving that person well in every future relationship they enter, not simply the current one being navigated with this specific avoidant partner. There's an important distinction worth naming here as well, because this specific quality, unmonitored acceptance, can be easily confused with something that looks similar on the surface, but reflects something considerably less healthy underneath: resigned apathy rather than genuine security. Someone who has simply given up on a relationship, who no longer expects anything different and has stopped caring enough to invest emotional energy into monitoring or reacting to an avoidant partner's behavior, might appear from the outside to be offering exactly the same unpressured, accepting presence this exploration has been describing throughout. The underlying experience, however, is entirely different: resignation and emotional withdrawal rather than genuine, secure acceptance. This distinction matters because these two states, while superficially similar in their outward behavior, tend to be sensed quite differently by an avoidant partner, even when neither person can articulate exactly why one feels different from the other. Genuine acceptance carries a quality of warmth and presence alongside its lack of monitoring, remaining genuinely engaged and genuinely caring while simply not requiring performance or correction in order to sustain that engagement. Resigned apathy, by contrast, carries an absence of genuine warmth alongside its lack of monitoring, a withdrawal that happens to look similar on the surface, but that reflects disconnection rather than security.